Standing in a foreign country, watching them be put into handcuffs on national TV, I could hardly breathe. I felt waves of guilt and fear wash over me. How had I let this happen? Why had I even come here? How could I betray my family like this? Would I ever be able to go home again? Before we get there, I need to explain how I was feeling a few weeks before I ended up in China. The home I grew up in hadn't felt like home at all. I'd known my whole life I was adopted. My parents told me growing up that my biological parents had lived in rural China. They had both died of a disease long, long ago, right after my parents had adopted me. When I was younger, it didn't really bother me. After all, I hadn't known my biological parents. It didn't really matter to me that my mom and dad weren't biologically related to me. But as I got older, it started to bother me more and more. People always assumed my mom and dad weren't my parents, simply because they didn't look like me. Sometimes people in public would try to speak to me in Mandarin. It made me feel like an alien. It made me feel like I didn't know anything about my culture or who I really was. Around this same time, I started having weird nightmares. In the dreams, I was in a cold, concrete room. There were kids crying around me and bars on the windows. I would try to get out, but anytime I managed to walk out the door into the hall would keep getting longer and longer and longer until finally someone would grab me. The dreams and the isolation I was feeling was really starting to affect me. So I started to ask my parents more about who my biological parents were. What part of China were they from? What were their names? What did they look like? Did they have my eyes, my nose, my smile? Every time I asked, my mom would get all weird. She'd avoid eye contact and try to change the subject. Over time, all I managed to get out of her was that she had only talked to my parents once during the adoption process. They seemed like fine people, and she was sorry when she heard they passed, but why was my mom being so strange about it? Why did it make her so uncomfortable? Around my 16th birthday, the weight of not knowing had started to be a little too much to carry. I checked the mail one day before my parents got home to look for the birthday cards from the extended family, but what I found in the pile of mail totally shocked me. A letter addressed to my mom from China. I opened the letter to see the entire thing written in Chinese characters. Was this from my family? Who else would be writing to me in Chinese? Just as I looked over the letter, I heard a car door open. I stuffed the letter in my pocket and hurried upstairs. That night, all I could think about was the letter. I decided first thing in the morning I was going to go see a translator and get to the bottom of this. When the translator read the letter aloud to me, my heart sank. It was a letter from my biological parents, asking my mom to wish me a happy birthday. They had thought about me every single day since they had given me up, and they had regretted it ever since. They begged my mom to let them contact me, to wish me a happy birthday, even to just see how I was doing. I felt the tears well in my eyes. My biological parents were alive, and from the sound of things, they had been trying to contact me ever since. I raced home with the letter in hand. I should have given myself a moment to calm down, but I just couldn't. I told my mom I knew the truth, and she assured me I didn't. She told me that she was my real mother and that she was the only person I needed. I felt the fury inside me. I couldn't even see straight. And I told her she wasn't my real mom and she had lied to me. My mother called me ungrateful. I rushed upstairs blindly with tears in my eyes. I was ungrateful? I was dumb? I was being inconsiderate? I glanced to the envelope on my desk. An envelope with an address. If my mom thought all those things, maybe she'd be better off without me around. Before I tell you what I did next, I need you to promise not to judge me. I had just found out my mother and father had lied to me about my birth parents my entire life. I had always felt like I didn't belong to them, and in that moment, I felt really alone. Have you ever felt like that with your own family? Like you're an outsider? Well, that feeling is what led me to the airport in the middle of the night. I had all the cash I had saved over the years, a passport, and an address. I was going to meet my birth parents, whether my adopted parents liked it or not. This was my story, and I was going to get to the bottom of it. So I flew to China, to the nearest airport by their village. Halfway through the flight, I looked out over the ocean and felt dread wash over me. Had I made the right choice? Was I really going to do this? After a really long flight, I took a long bus ride through the countryside. I had gone online and hired a translator to meet me there. Her name was Wa, and it felt good to finally be with someone I could speak to. The world outside looked so different from my life back home, and even though it looked oddly familiar, I still felt a bit out of place. Wa and I had to take a motorbike to the address on the note. When we arrived at the village, I was a little bit shocked. It was run down and rough looking. I stood outside the door, my hands shaking. I knocked. A woman and a man answered. When they saw me, their faces fell. For me, it was just like looking in a mirror. I couldn't speak. I completely froze. Wa told them I was their daughter. Just as she did, the woman pulled me into a hug. Wa told me they said they knew I would come back to them. They invited me into the house. I tried not to stare, but it wasn't really in the best condition. Everything seemed super dated, and the electricity seemed to hum through the exposed outlets. Surely there weren't a lot of jobs around here. We sat and talked for a long time with Wa translating. I couldn't believe my parents were sitting in front of me. My real parents. I felt so connected to them, like a part of me that had been missing was finally solved. I asked them why they had ever given me up and why my parents had kept it a secret. They both got really quiet. I tried to open my mouth to talk, but I instantly felt like I had done something wrong. The air seemed heavy and suffocating. My mom stood up and asked if I wanted to set my stuff down in the spare room to get settled in. For the next couple days, I stayed with them. My biological mom showed me how to cook some traditional meals. I got to explore the town, and honestly, everything seemed great. But every time I asked about how I ended up with my adopted parents, my biological parents changed the subject. The nightmares, the one in the concrete room, started to come back. It seemed like every single night it was getting worse and worse. I realized during one of the dreams that I was in a room on a boat. But why did it feel so familiar? As the days pressed on, I started to feel a little bit of anxiety. Why wasn't my family telling me anything? Sure, I loved being with them and seeing my culture, but I felt like there was something else going on. They both left every day to go to work, but I would watch them walk a few doors down and disappear into another house. On a rainy night, I had Wa tell my biological mom I wanted to know the truth once and for all. I had started to worry about my adopted parents back home by now. Surely they were starting to freak out about where I had gone. My biological mom started to tear up. She told me they weren't those people anymore, that they would never do it again. Before I got a chance to ask what they had done, my biological dad rushed in telling my mom they had an emergency at work. My mom left the building. I laid down and tried to turn on my phone for the first time since we landed. I was tired of laying on the floor here. I was tired of the humidity. I was tired of not getting answers. And most of all, I was starting to miss my parents a bit. I'll never forget what I saw when I went online. There were endless articles about me being missing, me being kidnapped. My heart was pounding out of my chest. They thought I was kidnapped. I kept scrolling, my heart beating faster and faster. That's when I saw it. Parents suspect in daughter's disappearance. They thought my mom and dad back home were behind this? I watched news footage as my parents were put into handcuffs. I scrambled to my feet. I had to get back home. I called Tawa and asked her if she could get us a bike to get back to the city. We had to go ASAP. I rushed down towards the building my biological parents always went into for work, and I couldn't believe my eyes. Walking in the back door, there were kids. A lot of kids. Babies being filed into the house. I backed up in horror. What on earth was going on in there? Terror filling every inch of my body, I ran. I met up with Wa and we hopped on a bike, rushing towards the city. I glanced in the rearview mirror for an instant and saw my biological parents standing in the street looking at me. We made it back to the city and I said goodbye to Wa, thanking her for everything. The rest of the journey I would have to do alone. The whole flight home, I couldn't sit still. What had my biological parents been doing? Were my adopted parents going to be okay? The second I landed at the airport, I rushed to the counter and told them to call the police. It was only an instant before the red and blue of the police cars were splashed across the building. They took me to the jail my parents were being held in. I explained everything from start to finish. After a few hours in cold, creepy rooms, I was finally released alongside my parents. My mom took me in her arms, sobbing. She thought I had died. She thought she was never going to see me again. I cried, explained that I just wanted to see who I was. We went home and they both sat me down. My mom took a deep breath. Was she shaking? Was she finally going to solve this mystery? That's when she told me the truth. My biological parents had sold me on the black market to some really, really bad people. They were desperately poor and couldn't afford to live. I was shipped across the Pacific Ocean in a cargo ship and kept in a metal room. When I arrived, the police busted the operation and rescued all the kids on board. My parents adopted me after I was put in foster care. My biological parents had reached out to my parents year after year trying to contact me. Finally, it all made sense. The nightmares I'd been having were memories. That's why everyone had been so reluctant to talk about my past. It was actually horrifying. I started to feel sick to my stomach. My biological parents had sold me? And judging by that creepy building they worked in, they were still involved in that horrible black market stuff. My parents and I reported them to the Chinese authorities, and last I heard, they had been arrested. I talked to my mom about why I had gone over there and how I was feeling. She understood my desire to understand where I came from. She even told me if I wanted, we could all go to China next year as a family. Since then, I've realized my identity is important. I should have been more vocal with my parents about how I was feeling. Now, I understand who I am. I may not look like my parents, and they may not be blood related, but they are my parents, and I'm so lucky to have them in my life. I hope you liked my story and learned from it. Have you ever felt confused about who you are, or felt like the black sheep in your family? Let me know in the comments down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.